Whom would you choose to run a business, a male executive or Athena, the Greek goddess of wisdom? If it were up to John Gerzema, he'd choose the goddess, and not just because of her looks. He's the author of the Athena Doctrine, and he joins us now on INSEAD Knowledge. John, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks, Chris.
John, many business schools, INSEAD included, have been influenced by your book, which says that the way female executives think may be better for the world than the way the old boys have been handling things up till now. Why is that the case, and what is the Athena Doctrine?
Right. So the book, Chris, is really about the rise of feminine skills and competencies around the world. And I think one of the most interesting things about it was there was 64,000 people that we surveyed around the world that looked at what they wanted in an ideal modern leader. And we started to see things like selflessness, patience, long-term thinking, empathy, collaboration, sharing credit. A lot of these things people also thought were feminine. And yet at the same time, we went then around the world and we saw some of the most amazing women and men that were sort of leading in a new way. So it's not really just about men versus women. It's about really amazing men and women that are realizing that these feminine skills and competencies are really vital today, and they can be a competitive advantage.
And it's not just the female traits that are so important, but also a mixture of masculine and feminine values.
Yeah, absolutely. And in one of our questions, we asked people, and we sort of saw back 81% of people said, man or woman, you need both masculine and feminine traits to thrive in today's world. And I think that's really a reflection of where we're at. You know, I think there was a lot of frustration with sort of masculine structures. And the interesting thing about that was a high degree of men in a lot of different countries were also frustrated with the conduct of men. And what it was really about was sort of these underlying sort of, challenges in politics and just the sort of traditional ways that business has been done. And so people are looking for something different.
Why is the conduct of men causing such dissatisfaction?
Right. So men have kind of been in charge for a long period of time. And I think what's happened is there's been a swirling of different forces, right? There's been the global financial crisis. There's been a huge degree of cynicism that's been levied on sort of large institutions and corporations. In our data, 86% of people felt that institutions have accumulated too much power. At the same time, Young and Rubicam and Brand Asset Valuator, our brand database, we've tracked a 50% decline in trust in institutions since the crisis. Go one step further, look at the financial sector, we've got a 10% level of trust in the banks and financial services category in our consumer data. So you look at sort of that part of it. The other part of it you look at are the rise of millennial values. Young men and women that want socially meaningful work. They want to build that in to sort of the companies that they want to work with and work for. And then, other trends exist around, globalization, where increasingly companies realize that their business and their welfare are all intertwined with the performance and the welfare of a whole bunch of other people throughout a global supply chain. So you kind of have this world that's become more social, more transparent, and more interdependent, and yet the skills that we've been using to sort of conduct traditional business, I think, has been a little bit antiquated and hasn't really caught up to this reality.
Where and how and for how long did you conduct your research?
Sure. So the Athena Doctrine is based on the goddess Athena, who is the goddess of wisdom, but also civility. But we also picked the title because she was also the goddess of mathematics, and that's my background. I focus on strategy. How do you understand consumer trends in culture, and how these things come to bear and how companies need to adjust and adapt? So we started out actually writing a book about what people want. And when we started to do some initial research, we started to see this interest where people started to talk about these more feminine traits, as they described them, being more important today. And so we got deeper into it, and we took our sample, 64,000 people in 13 countries. It's about 2/3 of global GDP. We took half the sample and we asked them to classify 125 different human traits, things like collaboration, aggressiveness, candor, etc. And yet we took the other half of the sample without any gendering at all, and we basically asked them to talk about ideal qualities for modern leadership. What does it mean to be successful? What does it mean to drive morality and happiness today? And so what we did is we modeled that data, and that's where we started to see a lot of consistency around the world about what people thought was masculine and feminine, and yet that these feminine traits and values, these skills, were in ascendance. And that's really where we started to get the impetus for our learning.
How receptive have businessmen been to your ideas? Are they already adopting more feminine values?
Chris, we really describe it as an emergent form of leadership. As we traveled around the world, in addition to collecting the data, we traveled to 26 different cities. We met with a lot of iconoclastic people, really interesting leaders of all ages and all walks of life, in politics, in education, science, business. We talked to some very enlightened and interesting, Fortune 500 CEOs, but a lot of the traction of this idea were in millennial-based businesses, whether they were startups or NGOs, maybe perhaps because they were starting from a blank slate, but at the same time, they were using these skills to thrive and to create really viable new businesses. So there is a lot of interest in corporations. We're actually guiding and building out workshops right now for management teams to come together, men and women, to basically take the test against what are the qualities of an ideal leader, and then really work through the underlying sort of issues and opportunities that exist that we see coming out of the data that guides sort of a bespoke workshop.
So if the world would be a better place if men thought more like women, what about the way women think? There are still many obstacles to women in the boardroom, for instance.
Yeah, absolutely. So when I started in the business back in the 80s, when Duran Duran was popular and I had hair, women actually wore shoulder pads, right? So they were all sort of conforming to these masculine ideas of being tough and aggressive. And I think the qualities we saw in these Athena leaders around the world, they were really tough people. They were facing tough challenges. It's just they went at it a different way, right? They were more attuned to what is today a services economy. It's not a manufacturing economy, so better listeners, better communicators. But they were also really sort of courageous with their convictions, that they would put their own sort of personality out there in a way that would make a change. And so I think that's really what it's about. It's about sort of bringing more humanity back into business. And as far as for women, I think women have to understand that there are tremendous opportunities today by realizing that the way they think is really important and really vital to today's global economy and to the advantages of the future. So I really sort of frame it less about men versus women and more about men understanding that these feminine qualities can be really important sources of innovation, and they should really be listening closely to the women in their offices.
Aspiring women have increasingly been told to downplay feminine values and perhaps conform more to masculine values to survive in business. What can women learn from the Athena Doctrine?
The challenge has been business has been so one-dimensional on a more masculine ideal. And you see it in the data around the world, by and large, in most countries, the Northern Europe sort of as the exclusion, women are somewhere in the range of 16 to 18% on corporate boardrooms and leading companies. And yet you look at other data and statistics, they guide nearly 80% of the purchasing power or influence in most of the products we buy. So I think you step back and you think about the company of the future that's going to follow the marketplace. You've got this incredibly important desire for companies to realize that they've got to bring these feminine values into fold if they're going to really be relevant in the future.
And what is your view of the business world 5 years from now?
I'm really optimistic about it. I mean, I think that this is actually the most incredible, most interesting time to be in business. When I started, there obviously wasn't social media. There wasn't the rise of consumer power the way it is today. And so I think what you're going to see is the definition of what a public company is. The aperture on that is going to open widely. I think public company today is shareholder value. The public company of really tomorrow is about employee value. It's about community value. It's sort of the macro environment about how do you really be accountable inside sort of a larger viewpoint of who creates the value for the organization. Peter Drucker said it best: the only purpose of a business is to have a customer. And I think the CEOs of the future are going to have to really focus truly on the marketplace if they're going to be relevant.
John, thank you very much for joining us on INSEAD Knowledge.
Thanks, Chris.